Ted, thanks for coming on. Really appreciate you taking the time to have a conversation with me. Would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself before we get started?
Sure. My name is Ted Parent. I am currently assistant professor of philosophy at Nazarbayev University in Astana, Kazakhstan. I'm an American citizen. I've been here for about just over 2 years, and I got my PhD at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Prior to coming to Astana, I was for many years at Virginia Tech, but here I am now on the other side of the planet.
Cool. So the topic today was critiquing the modal ontological argument. Could you tell me your position on that?
Yes, well, maybe we should start by just saying what the modal ontological argument is.
Sure.
It's a argument given by Christian philosopher Alvin Plantinga, although it has historical roots going back to at least Leibniz. But the argument starts from the idea that our idea of God, our kind of conception of God, is of a maximally great being, a being. So actually, the way Anselm put it, who was writing even earlier than Leibniz, it's the being that which nothing greater can be conceived. And for Plantinga, as well as for folks like Leibniz, this means that the being in question must necessarily exist. Why is that? Well, if it didn't necessarily exist, that means it could possibly not exist. And that seems like a limitation on the maximal greatness that this being is supposed to have. So the idea is supposed to be, look, if this is the greatest conceivable being, it has to be a being that necessarily exists, that could not possibly fail to exist. Now, that's the idea of God that we have. And then the question becomes, is such a being real? Well, Plantinga says, if you adopt certain plausible assumptions about possibility and necessity, the ideas of possibility and necessity, then you have to conclude that such a being is real. Now, this can get a little bit technical, but the root idea behind all this is the idea that if it's possible for something to be necessarily existing, then it must necessarily exist. Let me say that again. If it's possible for something to exist necessarily, then it exists necessarily. Why is that? Well, it's basically that if you concede the possibility of a necessarily existing being, then it has to be that there's a possible scenario where there's a being which exists in every possible scenario. That's what it would mean to say it's possible there's a necessarily existing being. There's a possible scenario where the being exists, and it exists necessarily, exists in every possible scenario. But if that's true, if there's a possible scenario where it exists in every scenario, then there's a possible scenario where it exists in this scenario, the actual world. And if it exists, remember, by definition of God, if it exists, it must necessarily exist. So if it's possible for it necessarily to exist, it's possible for it to exist here. And if it exists at all, it exists necessarily. So that means it must be a being for which it's possible for it to exist here necessarily. And if it's possible for it to exist here necessarily, um, then the reasoning goes basically that it must actually exist. Because look, if it's possibly a necessarily existing being, which would make it something that must exist here, then it would have to be a being that exists here. Now, if you find that reasoning a little bit funny, I agree with you. Um, and I think what happens in that reasoning, so this is getting into my criticism now, what happenings in that reasoning is that we take a little too seriously the idea that there are these possible scenarios. So, we kind of, when Planet gives the argument, he kind of gets wrapped up in the idea that, yes, there are really these possible scenarios. And in one of these possible scenarios, or possible worlds, he likes to call them, in one of these possible worlds, there is a being that exists in every possible world, which would mean that the being exists in this possible world, the actual world. But you have to take seriously that there is this other possible world where the being exists. Now, I should qualify and say, okay, let me backtrack a bit. Planet doesn't actually think there are other possible worlds, but he does think that the talk of possible worlds reflects a real fact to the effect that there are possibilities. So besides the actual world, there really are facts about what's possible beyond this world. Anyway, the point is, if you take seriously that there really are facts about what's possible beyond what exists in this world, then you end up saying, okay, so there's a possibility where a being exists in all possible scenarios. And that would mean that uh, that possibility would guarantee that the being exists in this scenario. Where I come in is that I say, hang on, I don't know if there really are these facts about what's possible beyond what is actual. I mean, so in one sense, there are facts about possibility because anything that's actual is possible. So you and I exist. So we are possible objects. Um, but more than that, Planetgo wants to say there's a possible object that necessarily exists. And I want to say, well, hang on, if that's not part of the actual world, do I really want to grant that there's a possible object of that sort? Or that there's some kind of fact about this being a possible object? My preference instead is to say there aren't really facts about possible objects, at least not in the ordinary way we think of facts. Instead, it's kind of more like um, facts as represented in a fiction. So, take for example the story of Pinocchio. We might describe the story as that, yeah, whenever Pinocchio lies, his nose grows. You might say, oh, is that a fact? Is that a fact? Well, it's not a fact about the real world. Pinocchio doesn't exist, so it's not a real fact, but it is a fact about what the fiction says. So, among the things that the fiction says, it is a fact that the fiction says Pinocchio grows a long nose whenever he lies. And I want to say that's similar to how we should think of possible facts that are not actual. So, just to take a less abstruse example, you might think that um, talking donkeys are possible. Maybe you think that's a possibility, but of course there are no actual talking donkeys. But you might say, well, they're possible. There's no contradiction in the idea, you might say. Well, what does that amount to then? Um, on my sort of view, it means that in the story that we kind of collectively adopt about what's possible, in that story, there is a world with talking donkeys. There is a non-actual possible world with talking donkeys. That's what we mean when we say talking donkeys are possible. We mean that in this story that we collectively hold, there is such a world. But of course, that's not to say there actually is, or there really is such a world. It's just to say it's part of the story that we collectively adopt. So similarly, when Plantinga says there is a possible world with a necessary being, I want to say, well, right, according to the story about possible worlds that we collectively assume, there is such a possible world, or there is such a uh, fact about what's possible in the story, much like it's a fact in the story that Pinocchio grows a long nose. But when Plantinga then says, okay, from the story that we are talking about, it follows that the being exists in all possible worlds, including this world. I want to say, well, hang on. We were just talking about a story. We were just talking about a story where there's a possible world in which a being exists in every possible world. And according to the story, yes, it would be true that the being exists in the actual world, because according to the story, it exists in every possible world. But if the being exists in the actual world according to the story, it doesn't follow that the being exists in the actual world. You can't make conclusions about what a fiction says um, concerning the real world just based on what the fiction says about the real world. So basically, the criticism I'm making is Plantinga's got lost in the fiction. Um, we adopt this fiction about possible worlds because it's useful for us in various ways. And then Plantinga kind of forgets that it's a fiction. And so he goes, yeah, yeah, okay, so there's a possible world where a being exists in every world. So there must really be such a being. Um, my response is say, okay, according to the fiction of possible worlds, there would exist a being in the actual world. But it does not follow that there is such a being in the actual world. That's taking too seriously the story. So I've talked a lot there. I don't know if you want to backtrack at all or help out any of that.
Well, this is a few things. The first is that I don't. One of the most important parts is understanding how you go from it being possible to it being actual, because it seems like the primary criticism of Plantinga's argument is the fact that he just seems to be going from imagination to reality based on nothing, and that seems to be what most people argue is the case for all ontological arguments. So it doesn't seem like that criticism is any different from the typical criticism of, well, you're just making stuff up with no basis in reality. And why, how do you get in the first place from these? You said there's these facts about um, possible things. What do you mean by facts? What does it mean to say that there are facts about possible things in that way? And how exactly does that lead to it existing in the real world? Because that's the part where I always misunderstand the argument of how exactly you go from it's possible to it is actual. That's the part that's a hard stretch to get intellectually.
Yeah, well, I feel you. I don't really get the connection myself. But I'll try to say what how he's thinking of it. He says, look, there really are facts about what's possible. I mean, besides facts about the actual world, it's
Well,
also
what does that
possible.
mean? What does it mean to say that there are facts about what's possible?
Yeah. So take, for example, it's possible that you might have been a dentist.
Right.
Um, we agree, yeah, that's true. And if it's true, then it's a fact. Um, so there's a fact about what's possible for you that is not actual. There's a fact about you possibly being a dentist.
And I
Um,
couldn't be a round square. So there's just facts that I could not be a certain way.
that's right. That's right. Um, so there are facts about what's not possible for you as well. So the thought is, okay, if we take that fact seriously, this is going to lead us into the existence of God. That's what Planica says. But part of where I get off the boat is I say, hang on, okay, yeah, it's kind of a fact that you could be a dentist, that it's possible for you to be a dentist, but not in the same way that it's a fact that you are a podcast host. We're talking about kind of two different facts. And that's what I was trying to illustrate with the Pinocchio example. Um, so, yeah, it's a fact that Pinocchio uh, has his nose grows whenever he lies, but it's not a fact. It's a fact just according to the fiction. But if you were to deny it, if you say no, Pinocchio's nose doesn't grow when he lies, well, you'd be saying something wrong. But it's just because it's wrong according to the fiction. So they're kind of these fiction relative facts. What's true according to the fiction, or what's a fact according to the fiction. So similarly, I want to say, okay, according to the fiction that we adopt about what's possible, yes, you could have possibly been a dentist. But it's not a fact in the way that um, the facts of the real world are facts. It's a sort of fact that's embedded inside of a fiction. So
So if
that's
I
how.
wanted to say something like I could be a dentist in the future per se, that's also a possibility. And so could you use that as an example to try to progress the argument without running into the problem of I could have possibly been a dentist past tense?
So things get a little complicated because, so strictly speaking, when we talk about what's actual and what's possible, we're kind of doing so in an atemporal sense. So when we say uh, it's possible for you to be a dentist, um, in the first instance, what philosophers mean is in the actual world, or sorry, what they mean is uh, there's a possible time at which you could be a dentist. Um, Now, actually, there are other interpretations of this talk about possibility where it just concerns time. So some people want to say, actually, whenever we talk about possibility, we're talking about different actual times that might occur. Um, so this is temporal logic. But in the modal ontological argument, we're not adopting that stance. We're not saying that talk of possible worlds is always talk about possible times. We're rather talking about kind of maximal states of affairs. Uh, so a possible world on this conception is a totality of facts. So you take any, I mean, an easy way to think about it is you take any sentence, any declarative sentence, such as today is Tuesday or today is Wednesday. I guess it's Tuesday for you. Uh, you take any declarative sentence, either it or its denial is going to be in a set of sentences which is maximally consistent. So any sentence or its negation is going to be in a set, but it's always going to be a consistent set. And you take all those sets of sentences, those define the so-called possible worlds in this discussion.
Okay.
So that's how we're thinking of it here. So in the actual world, there would either be a sentence in there that says, you, Tom Jump, are a dentist, or there would be a sentence in there that says, you, Tom Jump, are not a dentist. Or another example would be, there's a sentence in the set that says, you, Tom Jump, will be a dentist in the year 2028. Or there will be a sentence in there that says, you, Tom Jump, are not a dentist in the year 2028. So it's all sort of packed into a single world on this in this particular debate, which times are relevant.
Yeah, so it seems like a very bespoke usage of the word possible. It's very academic and doesn't really map onto the way most people use the word possible. Because the way most people use the word possible would essentially mean no logical contradiction or something along those lines. That's just, there's no logical contradiction that, and any possible sentence would be possible. And so this very specific, tailored use of the word seems to make things like equivocation, ambiguity, where you're using one word academically and people don't understand that, and so they're going to grant the um, more commonly used word and not realize that it entails some kinds of deep philosophical entailments that you just aren't granting because you don't know the specific usage that's being used by the person saying it, kind of a thing.
I hear what you're saying, and it turns out that even in ordinary language, talk of what's possible is very equivocal. So, is it possible for me to fly? Um, well, in one sense, no, I don't have wings or anything like that. But it's not like there's a logical contradiction if I say Ted can fly. It's not like I'm saying, um, you know, Ted is a round square.
Right.
So,
So, yeah, I would say both of those
so
would be.
even in ordinary language, yeah, there's different senses of possible. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
Oh, no problem. I was just thinking that the particular usage that you seem to be applying seems very, very specific to academia. I don't think any regular person would understand that definition easily without some
Oh,
background knowledge of
mm,
philosophy.
yeah. I mean, they're trying that the philosophers are trying to kind of lay out in detail what an ordinary person often means by possible. And of course, the ordinary person doesn't lay out in detail what they mean. So the philosophers are trying to do that for them. But I grant that they may be missing the mark. They may be uh, taking the details in such a way that they end up describing something else than what people usually mean by possible.
So if we applied any of the common use definitions of possible, would Plantinga's argument still work based on any of just the common ways people use possible?
Ah, I think that's a great question because, yeah, I mean, my own suspicion is that very often, not always, but very often when people talk about what's possible, they're talking about what's compatible with what they know. So it's a notion that is known as epistemic possibility. It's uh, sentences or judgments that are compatible with what you know. So in that conception, no, it's not possible for me to fly because we know I can't fly. Um, but you know, there are other things like maybe there's a second Higgs boson. Well, that's possible. We don't know that there's a second Higgs boson. We don't know that there isn't, but we don't know that there is, so that's possible. So they're talking about a fact about the actual world only, and they're saying what's possible for the actual world, and they're talking about what's possible relative to what they know. Anyway, if you talk about possibility that way, yeah, I think it's pretty clear then that Plantinga's argument doesn't work. Now, he doesn't intend it to be read that way, but you might like this way of reading it because it's more of an ordinary notion of possibility. But if you
What?
read it that way, he ends up saying the argument sounds like he's saying, look, for all I know, there could be a being that has to exist. Um, and if it is possible for that being to exist in every possibility, then they exist in every possibility, so they have to exist. And you're saying, okay, well, that's all nice and good, but we were just supposing, right? We were just kind of like, you know, imagining how things might be given what we know.
That seems to
We
be what
just,
it sounds like to most people when you say the modal ontological argument. I think that's what most people get out of it when you actually express the propositions.
yeah. And in fairness to Plantinga, I mean, he doesn't mean it that way, but your point is well taken that the way he does mean it might end up being a rather unnatural way of understanding the notion of possibility. And
Right.
so
So
he might have a
the reason I
point
wanted to
only
bring
if he
that up
says, yeah,
is because I think that it would be helpful for most people without an academic background to try to rephrase it into what Plantinga means without using the very confusing language. And I want, do you know a way to do that? Is there a way to do that to try to re-express Plantinga's argument in a way that average people can understand without having the background of the particular usages of the language in philosophy?
I can try. I don't know if I can succeed. Um, I mean, part of the problem is that this talk about possibility really is strange in meaning. So in English, it just means a lot of different things. So it's hard to get a fix on what specific meaning he has in mind. But let me try. Suppose we mean by possible what is free from logical contradiction. So anything that doesn't sound like my cat has a tail and has no tail at all.
Married
So
Bachelor,
that's
Round
not
Square.
possible. Yeah. But all the other stuff is possible.
Yeah,
So suppose we try to fix on that meaning. Then Plantinga will say, well, here's something that also seems possible according to that notion. There is a being that has to exist. Um, and then he ends up saying, if such a thing is possible, then it exists in every, then there's no way that it couldn't exist. And so it would have to exist according to the way things actually are.
so this is the part where I get a little lost because I like to, it seems like I would grant the first premise. It is possible, it's logically possible that in every possible world, there is in fact a being X or some object that has property X. Sure, that seems perfectly rational. Um, but it doesn't seem to entail that it is necessarily the case. Like, because it seems also possible that there is no such being. But that statement would, under this I don't know, epistemology, seem to have to entail some kind of a logical contradiction. It seems like the sentence, it is impossible that it is possible there is no necessary being, must entail a logical contradiction given the language being applied.
Yeah. How about let's try it this way. Let's just define the term God as a being that necessarily exists.
Sure.
So far, we haven't said whether there really is such a being, but we're just defining the term. Well, then it's true by definition that the being necessarily exists. And if it's
Sure.
true by definition that the being necessarily exists, then it'd be contradictory to say that the being does not exist.
That part I'm not following because I could say it's logically possible that there is a necessary being. So it's logically possible that there is a being that's necessarily that requires it must exist in all possible worlds. But I think it's still logically possible that there is no necessary being. I think both of those are logically possible simultaneously, and I don't see
Mm.
why there would be a contradiction in the second sentence simply if you grant the possibility of the definition of a necessary being.
I mean, I'm going to agree with you in the end, but I'm trying to give Plantinga
Yeah.
its fair shake. And one thing I should add too is that the version of the argument I just gave is not Plantinga's. It's kind of a more simplified version. But it's my view is that Plantinga's argument, even though it's more complicated, is doing essentially the same kind of mistake. That you get too wrapped up in your talk about possibility, and you notice that, oh, we can talk about a possibility of a thing that has to exist. And so then it's inconsistent to say of that thing that it might not exist. Uh, yeah, well, we started off just kind of in our imagination, and you can't just jump outside your imagination after that. The most I think you get is in the imagination, or in the fiction, as I like to put it. In the fiction, there is a being that actually exists that must exist. But we're still in the fiction, you know. We can't actually jump outside the fictional world into the real world without making a mistake. So I think, yeah, in the end, I don't know if I'm going to be able to make this satisfying for you, because
Well,
I
this
don't
is
think it is satisfying.
well. So my question is because I've debated the ontological argument with a number of people. Ben Arbor is one who I've talked with it about a number of times before his unfortunate passing. But um, the one thing I think that is entailed by the argument is that there has to be a logical contradiction in the uh, opposite of the claim. So if you want to say it's possible God exists, therefore it's necessary that God exists, then if you take the inverse of that, it's possible God does not exist, or if you say it's possible a necessary being does not exist, would have to entail a logical contradiction. It seems like that would be an entailment of the argument. For the argument to hold that it's possible a necessary being exists, therefore a necessary being exists, that the opposite is possible for a necessary being not to exist, would therefore a necessary being doesn't exist, would have to entail a logical contradiction. Like it has to be logically impossible for that statement to occur for the conclusion to be rational. Would you agree with that? Did you understand that?
Yeah, and I think Plantinga is going to say there is a logical contradiction. The contradiction is this: it's possible that there might not be a being that has to exist. So let me see if I can put that clearer. Um, it's not necessarily the case that a necessary being exists. And Plantinga wants to say, well, wait, if it's a necessary being, it has to exist, in which case it's not possible for it not to exist. So the contradiction would be between saying the being necessarily exists and it might not exist.
Right. So this is where I think it goes into your counter to the argument where it's a transition between the imaginary and reality, because it seems like there's equivocation going on between when you say it's possible a necessary being doesn't exist. That seems rational because you're not saying the being isn't necessary. You're just granting that by definition it's necessary. But the actuality of that being existing is what you're denying. You're saying it's possible that its existence is false. But in the way Plantinga is using the definitions, it seems like he's simply saying, as the way you put it, is it possible a necessary being isn't necessary? You're conflating the definition of the being and trying to show a contradiction in changing the definition, as opposed to rejecting the actual point of the criticism, which is saying that if I grant the definition of the being, it doesn't exist in actuality. And so it's conflating the definition aspect and the reality aspect.
I, I'm with you. Uh, so uh, I think another way of putting your point is, look, you can define the term God however you want. So you can define it as a necessary existing being if you want. It doesn't follow that there's anything that meets that definition.
Yeah.
So, you know, um, Now, again, Plantinga has a way of trying to make this more plausible by bringing in this apparatus of possible worlds, where he says, okay, right, it doesn't follow there's something that actually meets the definition, but there is a possible object that meets the definition. And here's what I want to say. Well, okay, in the fiction, there's a possible object. And then you can't jump out of the fiction once you got in it. But it's his mistake then is to say, well, no, when we're talking about possibilities, we're talking about facts. And not just facts in fiction, but facts. It really is a fact, for example, that you could have been a dentist. It's as good a fact as any. And that's why I want to get off the boat and say, no, it's not as good a fact as any. It's a fact in a fiction, much like Pinocchio's nose grows when he lies.
Well, let's say I wanted to just grant both of those premises. Let's say I grant it is possible there's a necessary being, and there are these facts that it's referring to. Why can't I still use the same objection and say, even if that's the case, it doesn't mean it's actual? I can still say it's possible there are facts. It's possible that there's a necessary being, but it's still rejecting the possibility that it actually exists in the world.
Well, Plantinga would accuse you of being inconsistent. I
How
wouldn't
so?
do
Like
that.
this is the part I don't understand why that would be inconsistent. That's the part I've struggled with.
So I suspect what's happening is you're working with a notion of possibility that's very natural, very common, um, and makes perfect sense. Uh, Plantinga is going for a more abstruse notion of possibility. And he is probably right that according to that more abstruse notion, there's an inconsistency. But it seems like the possible scenarios that he's talking about are not going to be ones that really connect to the real world. And I mean, another way he might try to trip you up is to say that you're equivocating on possibility. So he might try to trip you up by saying, okay, you think it's possible for you to be a dentist,
Sure.
um,
Yes.
and you think it's possible that there could be a necessarily existing being.
Sure.
But then you want to go on and say that a necessarily existing being might not necessarily exist.
Yes. So I want to say all of those things. Would agree with all of
And
those
he
things
would
that you just
say that last bit is consistent only if you mean something different by your two uses of necessarily. So if you say a necessary existing being might not necessarily exist, he'd probably say something like, okay, now you're talking about it might not necessarily exist relative to what you know. So you got that epistemic notion of possibility at work. But he says, I'm trying to stick to a metaphysical notion of possibility about what's really possible, not just possible relative to what you know, but what's really possible. So
so
he'll try to say that if you stick with the notion of metaphysical possibility, you cannot coherently say a necessarily existing being might not necessarily exist.
so why couldn't I say it's say logically possible to express that kind of possibility? Say it's logically possible for there to be a necessary being, but it's also logically possible for there to not be a necessary being.
Ah, so there was a philosopher, Michael Tooley, actually, I think he's still alive, who raised that kind of objection to Plantinga. So he said, okay, can't you run the same argument uh, against the existence of God if you just tweak it a little bit? So put it this way, it's possible that there is no necessarily existing being. If it's possible that there's no necessarily existing being, then there couldn't be a necessarily existing being. because then it would have to necessarily exist. But if it's possible not for there not to be a being, then there couldn't be such a being. Therefore, there is no such being. So truly raised that version of the argument. And to his credit, Plantinga actually anticipated this version of the argument. And he ended up being a bit concessive, although not entirely. He ended up saying, okay, you know what? This shows that there is an open question about which of these is possible. He says, I claim a necessary being is possible. My opponent claims, Thule claims, it's possible that there is no necessary being. He says, right, I haven't given you reason to favor one or over the other. So he says, yeah, okay, fine. I haven't proven the existence of God, but that's kind of a fool's task anyway, to prove the existence of God. Nonetheless, he claims, I've at least given you something that can rationally motivate your belief in God. So you might find yourself just utterly convinced, sure, God is possible. God is possible. So necessarily existing being is possible. If that's where you find yourself, then he says, yeah, I can then get you to being a theist. But yeah, he grants that if you are dead set in your ways, you can resist the argument and say, no, 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 no. A necessarily being is not necessarily something that exists. And then you can argue to atheism from there.
Well, so one of the parts I really love about that is when he says that he hasn't proven God exists or proven God does not exist, and both statements are open to possibility. I mean, I think that means both are possible.
Yeah. I'm sure he would reply to that by saying, no, 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 you're conflating the epistemic sense of possibility again with the metaphysical sense that he wants to stick with. But I mean, in the tradition of philosophy I come from, the epistemic sense of possibility is really the one that matters. And the metaphysical sense is kind of a contrived sense that we can sort of artificially prop up. But really, the notion of possibility is something that evolved for organisms like us because we were just trying to figure out what else is true based on what we know. So it was very much a kind of embedded in the real world, trying to figure stuff out, what we can say. And yeah, so I think your way of talking is perfectly natural and also in a lot of ways preferable. But it is not the way he's trying to talk. He's trying to talk in this other way. And in that way of talking, he may have somewhat of a point that you cannot talk of a necessary being that doesn't necessarily exist. But my criticism comes in and says, okay, yeah, but this is all in this sort of fiction that you've constructed. And it doesn't actually follow from what's true in the fiction about what's true in the real world.
Well, it seems to me that when you're talking about the metaphysical possibility that he's describing, um, say one metaphysical possibility is necessitarianism, where everything is predetermined and it couldn't ever be a different way than the way it actually is, kind of a thing.
Uh,
And in this description of metaphysical possibility, we're essentially describing all of the facts and counterfactuals of the universe as just being a particular way. In this world, if there is a necessary being, then obviously there can't not be a necessary being. Just like if I exist, I can't not exist because I everything's necessary. So it must be the case that I exist in a necessitarian kind of a world. Um, and in that language, since we're talking about a necessitarian worldview, everything that is in fact possible. And so obviously, if it's possible, it must necessarily be the case. And that would be true of all facts, not just of a necessary being, but of all facts, right?
mm. I think I'm following you. So Actually, would it be fair to say that when you're talking about necessitarianism, you mean something like determinism, where all facts are sort of the unavoidable result of the laws of nature?
Oh no, I'm going further than that. I'm saying like there's some fact of reality that makes every single fact logically the only possible way it could possibly be.
Logically
Yeah,
necessary.
so like
Oh, okay.
say there's actually a necessary being, quantum field or God or something, and he makes it such that this is the only possible world, and he can't make any other possible world. It's just not
Ah,
logically
okay.
possible. It's a contradiction with his nature. So this is literally the only way the world could ever be in any way. And then like to say I had an extra hair on my head would just be logically impossible for some reason.
Okay. Um, so I'm a bit baffled by that view, except though there are philosophers who defend this view. So there's a guy at Oxford, Tim Williamson, who thinks that he is a necessarily existing being, um, because, well, it's something like this, that you cannot describe a possible world where he does not exist. Because in order to refer to him not existing, he has to exist for you to refer to him. So you cannot say, possibly Tim Williamson doesn't exist. Who? Tim Williamson. Oh, that guy there. Yeah, he's there. Yeah, Pepsi doesn't exist. Ah, that's a contradiction. Um, so yeah, there are people who believe this, that as a matter of logical possibility, there's nothing that doesn't exist necessarily. And yeah, then it just doesn't make sense for us to talk about possibilities that don't exist.
Right, but
Because
isn't that the exact same thing Plantinga is doing?
uh, yeah, so if necessitarianism is true, then you can't talk about non-actual possibilities. And so if you are um, an atheist, you're going to not grant the possibility that he's talking about in the first place. If you're an atheist and you're a necessitarian, you're going to say, okay, when Plantinga starts off by saying, well, it's possible that there's a God, you're going to say, no, 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 no. Sorry, it's not possible, because there is no God, and this is the only possible world. So it's not even possible that there's a God. So that's a kind of view that you might take if you, so you'd have to be a necessitarian and an atheist, and then you'd end up resisting the premise that a God is possible.
Gotcha. Um, so I think one of the things I'm interested in about is the metaphysical necessity part of saying, let's say that if we're saying it's possible that there's a necessary being, they're saying that there's metaphysically the universe could be such that there is a necessary being that is in all possible worlds. But if that's the case, then it would be essentially the same thing as the guy who's the philosopher who says he must exist. And so it's just like it don't see any difference from it being the case or just saying that God does exist or saying the necessary being does exist. Because if you're saying it's possible that it's metaphysically the case that there is a necessary being, seems to be just saying like no differently semantically, just like saying there is a God or something like that. Doesn't seem like there's any sufficient difference between those two sentences, given the very proprietary usage of the word possible that Plantinga is using.
So now I'm going to play devil's advocate, or maybe God's advocate, if you will. Uh, the reply is, that's exactly Plantinga's point. So you're agreeing with him now. You're saying, yeah, to say that the being is metaphysically possible is tantamount to saying that the being is actual. Um, and surely you think it's possible. So congratulations, you're a theist.
Well, I would say that given the very proprietary definition of possible being used, sure, but um, I wouldn't grant that definition. I would say that definition is incoherent or something along those lines, or just nonsensical, or doesn't actually represent what possibility means. So I think that would be probably my objection to that. I don't think I would agree with the particular definition being used by Plantinga about possibility.
Yeah. Um, yeah. That's pretty similar to where I come down on. I don't want to say it's incoherent notion of possibility, but it's one that's sort of just um, something imaginary. And the things we conclude about possibility in this kind of imaginary framework are just going to be disconnected to what's happening in the real world. Um, Now, one thing I should add, though, is when I talk this way about possibilities being imaginary, some people have objected to me saying, "Hang on, you're talking crazy now," um, because surely we can say true things about reality and what's possible. Um, like, for example, um, it's a common view, at least in philosophy, that necessarily mammals are animals. So there's a kind of view that biological essences are necessary. They're kind of essential to you. So it's essential to a mammal to be an animal. So necessarily mammals are animals. Secondly, for the same kind of reason, necessarily camels are mammals. It's kind of part of the biological essence of a camel to be a mammal. What follows? Well, necessarily camels are animals. Now, that piece of reasoning, you might say, is absolutely knocked down solid, and it applies to the real world. But it's all embedded in this talk about necessarily, which has to do with what's possible and what's not. So if I'm sitting here talking, oh, possibility is just an imaginary framework and it doesn't apply to the real world, people might say, well, look, you're flying in the face of how people do reason correctly using notions of possibility and necessity. In reply, I say, yeah, it can apply to the real world, but it takes an extra assumption. And the extra assumption is something you can take in on board or not, depending on the context. So when we're talking about something as, uncontroversial as camels and mammals, sure, we can adopt an extra assumption that what we say in the fiction of possible worlds actually applies to reality. That's an extra assumption. And I'm not going to grant that assumption when Plantinga starts talking about God and
Could you
what's
say the
true about
assumption? What's the
God.
assumption again?
So the assumption is that um, what we say in the fiction of possible worlds and and specifically what we conclude about the actual world in the fiction of possible worlds, that also applies to the actual world. Um, so that's an extra assumption. So conclusions you make in the fiction about the actual world also apply to the actual world. That's the extra assumption. And that's an assumption I'm willing to grant when we're talking about camels and mammals. It's not an assumption I'm willing to grant when we're talking about Plantinga's God. So
And
when
what would be the
Plantinga,
difference between the camels and mammals and God? Why do we apply it in one case, not the other?
it's just because the stuff about camels is totally uncontroversial. Yes, camels are mammals. Um, Mammals are animals. Therefore, camels are animals. And you can say all of that holds necessarily insofar as you think that camels have a biological essence, maybe something to do with their DNA, where it's essential to them to be a mammal, and it's essential to a mammal to be an animal. And so all that holds a necessity. I can say, yeah, 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 all that is fine. I totally grant that. And so when we talk about what has to be true regarding camels, I can grant that our conclusions that we kind of work out in the fiction of what's necessary and what's possible, our conclusions that we work out there actually apply to the real world. But that's because we're dealing with just uncontroversial matters. But when Plana comes in and says, oh, guess what? It's of the essence of God to necessarily exist. So in the same way, he wants to say we can work out that God actually exists when we're in the fiction of the possible worlds. I mean, he doesn't put it that way, but that's how I'm reading him. And I say, okay, yeah, that's fine. I can even grant that. I can grant that in the fiction of possible worlds, it's of the essence of God to exist in the actual world. But I'm not going to grant that what we said in the fiction now applies to the real world. We were just kind of using this device of possibility and necessity to kind of work out some ideas. And in the camel's case, I'm willing to say, yeah, what we worked out in that framework has relevance to the real world because it's just uncontroversial stuff. But I'm not going to allow that when Plantinga starts talking about the essence of God. Now we're talking about something really controversial. And yeah, you can apply the framework of possibility and necessity to talk about God. But to say that actually has relevance to the real world is an extra assumption that I'm not going to grant in that case.
So when I hear that, I think of like the definition of animals, mammals, and camels or whatever. It kind of just seems like more specific categories. So like if I said a rose is a flower, flowers are a general category. Rose would be just more specific category of just describing the thing. And so if rose existed, it would be by definition a flower or something along those lines. Um, and I don't see a problem with that to say that those would be entailed. Like if there was a flower, would or if there was a rose, it would necessarily be a flower in a world. Now that obviously doesn't entail that there is a flower. There may not be a flower in the universe, or I could just use Harry Potter as a wizard or something.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
if Harry Potter logically, because he can do magic, he would be a wizard. So if Harry Potter existed, he would be a wizard, and that's a logical necessity based on the definitions of the word wizard in Harry Potter, because Harry Potter entails he's a wizard, or entails he can do magic, and a wizard is anyone who can do magic. But obviously doesn't entail that he exists. It just entails that if there is this relationship, and so if he existed, he would be this extension, have this extensionary property, which also doesn't necessarily exist. And so in the camel's case, it's using a property we already know exists. They already exist. And so we can use and infer those things in the same imaginary sense. It's just a concept that we've made up to describe these things. But since we already know they exist, we can infer that they are in fact true about the real world. Whereas if we apply a new property like wizard or something that has no evidence it exists, we can't we wouldn't have any reason to say it does apply to the real world. So the only reason we can apply the logical necessity of flower, camel, whatever, is because we know the property actually exists and we define it that way. And so I don't see why those two, to me, those sound the same as they would apply to God. Is we define God as a necessary being, just like we define Harry Potter as a wizard. Does that imply that such a property exists in reality? Well, no. And that's just going back to the same problem. How does Plantinga get there? Because I still don't understand how exactly he gets there.
The way you put it is excellent, actually. So, we start from the assumption that the camels exist, and then we can reason about their essential properties, and then we can make conclusions about what properties they have. But with God, we're not starting with the assumption that God exists. I mean, now we just beg the question. But Plantinga says, okay, well, we can still talk about what properties God would have in a possible world where God exists. And then he says, aha, necessary existence. That's one of the properties. Prove. So God exists. And you say, no, 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 no. When you're applying that framework of possibility and necessity to something whose existence is not conceded, and now I'm putting it your way, which I think was a very good way of putting it. When we apply that stuff to something whose existence is not conceded, whose existence is controversial, then all that stuff we come up with in the framework of possibility and necessity, it may not have any relevance to what really exists. But with camels, yeah, we start by everybody knows camels exist. So, yeah, we reason about their properties, their essential properties, their necessary properties, and then we can take that and apply it to the camels that we already granted existed. Um, yeah, but that's totally not the situation with God. So, yeah, I think it's a kind of Plantinga is kind of abusing the device of possible worlds or possibility necessity by applying it to things whose existence is not granted from the outset.
Definitely. So how does your response go from there?
Well, I've kind of been framing it in the way I like to frame it, which is, yeah, we have this framework of possible worlds. We can apply that framework to camels. We can also apply it to God, but since the existence of God is controversial, what we conclude in the framework is not going to necessarily apply to what exists. And Plantinga, I think, just misses that because, again, he takes very seriously that facts about possibility are facts. And I want to say, no, 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 they're not facts, at least not in the same way that it's a fact I'm wearing a shirt right now. Um, they're kind of facts according to a fiction. But once you step into fiction, you can't get out unless you take on that extra assumption I mentioned, which is where, like with the camels, you start off by assuming that you're talking about some real existent thing in the actual world. Then you can, yeah, make conclusions about the real world using talk about possibility and necessity. But that's only because you've brought in an additional assumption that isn't there when you're talking about God.
Has Plantinga responded to your criticism?
No, I don't know if he's aware of it. The paper was published in 2016, and I'm not in well, actually, I am in contact with some of the Notre Dame folks who are in logic, but I haven't had direct contact with Plantinga or Van Igwagen or any of those guys. So I don't know if he's aware of it. Um, but I'd be curious to see what he'd say. I'm not sure I can see a way out of it really, but he's a clever guy, so who knows? Maybe he's got a way out of it.
Do you have any idea, like a guess of how they would respond?
I think one, so I don't know about Plantinga, but I think maybe one point that people might push on is this whole idea that talk of possibility and necessity is part of a fiction. And I did try to defend it a bit by saying, well, just because it's a fiction doesn't mean it never has relevance to the real world, like with the camel examples. In fact, this is part of our concept of a work of fiction is that sometimes it does have relevance to the real world. That's often why we read novels, is because they teach us lessons about the real world. So a fiction can have relevance to the real world, but even so, I think some people would press and say, no, 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 we have to take notions of possibility and necessity more seriously than I do. Because otherwise, then, I don't know, there's always an open question about whether our conclusions about what's possible are true or whether they're just true in the fiction. So, we can make kind of insightful discoveries about what's possible. Um, in the late 19th century, it was shown that it was possible for parallel lines to intersect, contrary to what Euclid said all those years ago. It really is possible. So that was a monumental discovery. And someone might say to me, well, you can't take that seriously as it stands, because, if possibility and necessity is just playing with a fiction, then um, all you can say at that point is, well, yeah, according to the fiction, parallel lines sometimes intersect. But who cares? I mean, it's just a story we're telling. So they might say that I've sort of deflated the significance of some of the discoveries we've made about possibility. Um, yeah, well, actually, it's an interesting example that I happen to choose there, which has to do with mathematics. Mathematics is kind of a weird case to begin with. So, talking about what's mathematically possible, I don't know. I mean, there are people actually like Hartree Field at NYU who believes that mathematics is also a kind of fiction. Um, at least when you're talking about pure mathematics, um, you're talking about entities that have no actual reality. It's just a kind of story that we're telling about numbers and fields and whatnot. But so I might be able to defend the view that possibility is in the first instance a kind of fiction if I also adopt this mathematical fictionalism. Um, but to be honest with you, I'm not sure whether I should adopt that view of mathematics. I haven't thought about it enough to say whether that's really a view of mathematics I want to adopt. Um, so there is an open question here. Um, is the view of possibility that I'm advocating, does it not take seriously some of the discoveries made about possibility?
What would happen if we granted that mathematics was like real or some kind of platonic object?
Yeah, then it might turn out that we really should take it as a genuine fact that parallel lines sometimes intersect, that that's possible, that there are possible scenarios where parallel lines intersect.
And how would that
Now,
relate to Plantinga's argument? Would it in some way?
well, then the kind of push at this would be, okay, if we're going to take that possibility seriously, the possibility of parallel lines intersecting, then it seems like we have to take other possibilities seriously if we're not just going to be random in which possibilities we take seriously. So then we have to take seriously his possibility that there's a necessary being. And if we take that possibility seriously, then he's going to say, aha, gotcha. Um, now you grant that it's really possible for there to be a being that necessarily exists, a being that exists in every possibility. And
Would
that
you
would
grant that?
include,
So like say, given your understanding of Plantinga's argument, and if you happened to grant mathematical objects and the possibility of necessary beings, would you at that point grant Plantinga's argument, or would you still have a similar objection?
if I was a Platonist about mathematics, so I don't know whether I'm a fictionalist about mathematics, but I know I'm not a Platonist. So I can safely say then, if I were a Platonist, sure, I could grant Plantinga's point then. Um, now, uh, maybe that's a reason not to be a Platonist. Um,
Well, do you think
that's
that
not
there
my
are Platonists who would disagree and say that they can still be Platonists without granting Plantinga's entailments?
Oh, probably. I mean, a famous philosopher once, I forget which one, they once said, there is no view so outrageous that some philosopher hasn't defended it.
Yeah.
So, um, yeah, and you could probably come up with some ways of doing that. So, actually, this occurred to me while I was talking to you about this kind of case. Someone might say, okay, when we talk about the possibility of parallel lines intersecting, we're not actually talking about a possible world different from the actual world. What we're really talking about is actual mathematical models that exist as abstract objects in this world. And what we're saying is that in some of these actual abstract models, there are parallel lines and they intersect. So they might say, look, I don't actually have to invoke possibility at all in order to take seriously the idea that parallel lines sometimes intersect, because I just have to point to actual abstract objects in order to do that. Now, here's a big secret, however. I mean, it's no big secret, really. Actual abstract objects are precisely the way that Plantinga wants to think about possible worlds. Now, this is not a standard view, but it's not idiosyncratic either. It's a view that's lots of philosophers share. They say, yeah, this is exactly what possible worlds are. They're actual abstract objects
So
with these
ontic modal
different.
realism.
Yeah, yeah. Uh, it's not David Lewis's modal realism. So Lewis thinks there are concrete objects. Plantinga says, no, no, no. There are abstract objects, much like mathematical objects, that constitute these possible worlds. So I could imagine him firing back at the Platonists and saying, hang on, once you grant that there are mathematical models where parallel lines intersect, he'll say, you know, that's basically what I'm saying about God. There's a there's a model where God exists in every model. And the actual world, the real world, is just one of the models that's realized. So um, if you grant that there's a model where God exists in every model, then God is going to exist in this world.
I still don't see why that would entail like that there is not a model where God is not in every model. So like say there's an abstract object where God is in every model, and that's a real abstract object, like a platonic object. Why can't there be another platonic object where it's not the case?
Yes, yes. So that would be the Thule version of this of the earlier objection. So now instead of talking about possible worlds, we're talking about actual abstract objects as models. Yeah, Thule would say, don't we have a model where there is no necessarily existing being? And so wouldn't that mean that there isn't a necessarily existing being in this world? Because if there were, then it would have to exist in that model where there is no necessarily existing being. And they said there wasn't one in there. So, yeah, I think the argument could get turned on its head again, even if you cast it in terms of these abstract actual objects.
And then there was Plantinga's objection that he then now makes it a black and white. Either it is possible there is a necessary being, or it is not possible there is a necessary being, which 100% leads to theism, or 100% leads to atheism, which I kind of agree with. I think if we're just saying either it is the case there is a God, or that is the case there is not a God, even one of those has to be right. One of those has to be wrong logically, unless we have like some kind of non-standard logic going on or something. But let's grant standard logic. So one of those has to be true. But it seems like at that point, that's all he's saying. Like either there is a God or there is not a God. That seems like all the
Yeah.
argument boils down to. But there was one of the sentences when you were describing his response seemed to imply that there was a reason to pick one of those options, or either of those options. Like there's a reason to pick one of those options entailed in this realization. What was that?
Um, I don't know if it's much of a reason. It's something like, what do you find more theoretically plausible? Just pre-reflectively, are you more inclined to say that possibly there is a God, or is there a stronger intuition in you to say that possibly there isn't a God? Now, remember, we're talking about possibility in a metaphysical sense, not an epistemic sense. So, epistemically, you could grant both possibilities. Sure, for all I know, there could be or there couldn't be. But metaphysically, are we saying, just pre-theoretically, do you think it's better to say that such a thing is metaphysically possible, or such a thing, uh, or its non-existence is metaphysically possible? And I think for someone like him, he's going to say, yeah, you can't prove this issue, but for a theist, it's going to just be more intuitive to say that it's at least possible, metaphysically possible, for there to be a necessary being. And then he's going to say, congratulations, you're a theist, because my argument can get you there from here.
But if he grants the Thule case that the alternative also is the case, the only justification is your starting intuition.
Yeah, so he's going to say, all right, yeah, it's not a proof. It's not a proof, but it can be rationally motivated. And actually, there's a move happening here in the background, which may seem strange, but it happens with surprising frequency in philosophy, which is where often you come down to kind of what seems to be right as a starting point. So, why do you believe the principle of non-contradiction? Why do you believe that contradictions can't be true? It just seems that way. Actually, there are philosophers who question it. Some philosophers say there are instances of the principle of non-contradiction which are false, so that there are true contradictions. Uh, yeah, and if you get into arguments with those folks, you can realize pretty quickly that they can defend their view in a very, very clever way. One thing to remember is they're not saying all contradictions are true, just that some of them are. And
Paraconsistent versus dialetheism.
yes, yes. So, um, yeah, and that kind of debate too, you can really quickly realize it kind of comes down to what feels right to you from the start. And I think it's a frustrating way, it's a frustrating realization when you realize that philosophy often comes down to these sort of core intuitions that you already have. But I mean, in a way, Plantinga is being honest about that. And he's saying, this just seems to be how it is to me, that it's metaphysically possible.
I honestly
Um,
don't think that's necessarily a bad thing going down to those core intuitions, unless
mm,
they have some good defeaters. Like, for example, in the Plantinga one,
mm,
saying, do we think it's plausible there is a necessary being? Well, it seems like that's just an anthropocentric fallacy, just something common in all human intuitions, that is a product of evolution, that we intend to see agency in things where there is no agency. And so
mm,
it seems plausible to infer that this particular intuition that we have of looking for agency is a very
mm,
unreliable source of knowledge, and so that's an intuition we should doubt. Whereas in the case of the law of non-contradiction, that seems to be a fairly reliable one as far as we can tell, where there's no obvious reasons to doubt that one, and so we can grant that one for the sake of the argument. But in the case of Plantingas, I think we have really good reason to reject that one. I think he should have good reason to reject that one.
that's a nice distinction. Yeah. So um, that's a nice view. So you're saying, in some ways, you can't blame someone for just going by how things seem at the most basic level, but you ought to be on the lookout for defeaters. And sometimes there are defeaters, and sometimes there are not. And yeah, if there are no defeaters, you can't really be blamed for going by how things seem. But yeah, in the case of Plantinga, there are these things like Thule's point, which suggests, um, there might be an inconsistency in what your intuitions are telling you. Because I don't know about Planeta, but for me, it seems kind of equally plausible that a necessary being would be possible or a necessary being might not exist. Um, that would amount to inconsistent intuitions on the matter, and so I couldn't really trust either one. Um, yeah, I think that's a nice point. So, in that specific instance, if you find yourself kind of pulled in both ways, you can't really trust either way.
For sure. And I think the way I would phrase Plantinga's argument in a way that common sense people could understand it would be more like either God does exist or he doesn't exist. And that seems to be like the conclusion of the argument if you just phrase it in English. Because if he's going to grant Thule's position, then that essentially has to be what he's saying fundamentally. Either God does exist or he doesn't exist.
Yeah. Well, I myself would hesitate a bit on that, and the reason is because I I think there's a concept of God that is viable where God is not a necessary being. So I'm, a Christian philosopher like Plantinga would call me a heretic for even raising this, but um, one conception of God that may have some merit to it is a conception of God where God is not all powerful. And that can actually be independently motivated by the fact that the notion of omnipotence can by itself can create paradoxes like can God create the stone that he cannot lift? Um, so I actually like to take seriously the possibility, haha, that God is not omnipotent. In which case, it may turn out that God is not a necessary being. And so then there would be a kind of third path to go down. There's Thule's God that necessarily doesn't exist. There's Plantinga's God that necessarily does exist. And then there's this other option, which is a God that exists, but not necessarily.
Yeah, I think like the minimum requirement for a God for me would be um, something that is uncreated that created our universe or everything, at least the very minimum our universe to be a God that applies to us in some way. Or
Mm,
I guess maybe the only real requirement for a God would be something that was uncreated, fundamental nature of reality being. I think those are the only criteria that would be required for a God. So even if it didn't have any power to do anything, still probably be a
mhm,
God of some kind.
mhm,
And there could be many different gods, and one particularly that created this universe. And so I think, yeah, I definitely think that there are many, and I think there's a possibility of a God who is omnipotent but isn't necessary. So it can have all power but not be necessary. It could exist in most possible worlds, or there could be multiple different kinds of omnipotent gods, like Krishnu versus Yahweh, and they're both omnipotent, but neither one is necessary because they both exist in a different logically possible world.
mm. Oh, that's interesting. I mean, I'm sure Plantigo would want to argue with you that it's like, no, if they're omnipotent, then they have to exist. They have the power of existing in all worlds. Um, but one thing that you learn when you're studying the notion of omnipotence is omnipotence has to be, I mean, yeah, so if I pray for a cat that has a tail and has no tail, I pray very hard to God and God doesn't give me the cat. I mean, is that a limit on God's power? You might say, no, the non existence of that cat is not due to an inability on God. It's just because your talk in that case is just nonsense. It's just a mishmash of gobbledygook. And so you can't blame God for not giving you the cat. Um, so that's the kind of limit on omnipotence. And you might try to argue that existing in every possible world ends up being sort of inconsistent or impossible, maybe because you want to grant both of Thule's possibilities and Plantinga's, that a God could exist or a God couldn't exist, in which case, um, you couldn't be talking about a necessary being, in which case, yeah, God might be all powerful, but not in the unlimited sense of existing necessarily.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we've been going for about an hour and a half. It was a great conversation. Really enjoyed it. Do you want to give any links or references where people can find out more about your work?
Sure. You can go to my website, which is T, my first initial, and then my last name, parent. So tparent.net, .net. And there you can read about stuff I work on, and you can read the paper on Planiga. I actually work on a lot of different things. Some people think I've kind of hurt my own career by working on too many different fields because nobody knows where to peg me. Um, but feedback is always welcome. If you read something and you want to talk to me about it, please send me an email and I'd be happy to talk.
Awesome. Thanks again. Really appreciate the conversation. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
Okay, thanks. Thanks very much, Tom.